Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to the second video. So let me share the screen, adjust my video area, and make the presentation view. All right, so this is the second article. So Han Chaibong's The Miraculous Democracy, the 20-year retrospective, which is looking back on the South Korea's democratic consolidation. So this article was published in 2008, so not very recent one, but we can look through what were the transitions after the 1987, the mass protest to the more developed levels of the democratization. All right. So in the previous article, so we saw that based on the Samuel Huntington's and the model, the transplacement. So there were some of the energies. There were many of the actors and the agents. So the first agent was the regime elite, who are the military leaders, former military leaders where the concession making some of the arrangement with the agreement. So they were the authoritarian leadership facing pressure and seeking stability. And then because of the many of the incidents, including the torture death of the Chungcheol Park, who was the elite university student, there was a mass mobilization providing the pressure to the regime elite. So they started from the students and the middle class protesters joined later, and then with the negotiation. So based on the pressure to the regime elite, opposition leaders, which are the political leaders channeling the public demands, they pressed it together and they made the negotiations as the transplacement as a model of the changes. So regime elite, they had the fear of the chaos, instability, the international pressures in Olympics 1988. So you may remember that there was the Seoul Olympic. And the Rotel's concessions, which is the accepting the pressure and accepting the negotiations from the protesters and the opposition. So triggered by the Zhongshan Park's torture death, middle class participants, and many of the disputes. So there were some of the model we could see as the model of the transplacement. So compared with the previous article, Han Chaibong's democratic consolidation framework had a more the complex procedure. The procession from the transition to the maximalist democratic consolidation. So democratization was initial electoral democracy from 1987 and power alternation, which is the multiple peaceful transition between rival political forces. So not only the one stage, but there were many of the multiple stages of the rivalries in the I don't know, presidential election, and includes participation, which means the ideological broadening and the stakeholder inclusion, and the crisis resilience, system resistance, and the growth stronger with the shocks, and then full consolidation. They were the glued together. And the democracy is the only game in town, widespread legitimacy. So even though this article was published in 2008, so we could see that this framework is still valid, and it can analyze many of the incidents and many of the events in the political party in South Korea. So there are four key factors in the South Korea's democratic consolidation, which are the alternation of the power. All major political figures and fractions and the parties take turns governing, becoming responsible stakeholders in the democratic situation. And ideological inclusion, successful incorporation of the leftist progressives and the 386th generation, which are who are participating participating to the protests in 1980s and into mainstream politics, broadening the ideological spectrum. The elite pact making, which is the making the agreement. The political deal making between fractions enabled smooth transitions between governments with different ideological orientations, which means many of the political parties they have the different political orientations, and based on the agreement, they are trying to make very peaceful transitions and negotiations. And the crisis management, the democratic system strengthened through successfully overcoming major challenges like 1997 financial crisis and 2004 impeachment of the President the Mu Yeol-no. So based on his definition, there are the two major on the conflicts on the consolidation theory, maximalist and the minimalist. The minimalist definition is that focus on the procedural elements of free elections and the basic rights, formal institutions as the basic conditions of the democracy. Democracy is just when formal mechanisms work properly. South Korea achieved by early 1990s. The maximalist definition is the aiming high, democracy as the only game in town with a broad legitimacy among elites and public. Democracy exists when deeply embedded in the political culture and behavior. South Korea achieved by 2008, according to the HAM. And then there were more and more development of the democratic situation in South Korea. Ham argues that South Korea reached the maximalist consolidation because no significant political forces is alternatives in the democracy. Yeah, so democratic procedures are routine and accepted across society, and then electoral outcomes, even unexpected ones, are respected by all parties. The question is no longer will democracy survive, but how to improve democracy. According to the Han Chabong, power alternation includes that would be perceived as the inclusive activity. Power alternation was a crucial factor of the South Korea's demographic consolidation. The peaceful transfer of the power between competing political orientations and parties made democracy a shared enterprise. Stakeholder co-creation means all major political fractions and leaders had opportunities to govern, making them invested in the stability. Even though there were some the regional changes, but the regional integration previously included regions, which is the Jeolla province, which is the southern western, the southern southern no no southern western part of the South Korea gained access to power after several elections. And generation changes progressive leaders from 1980s student movement or the 386 generations, they eventually held office and elite acceptance. Both conservative and progressive elites recognize democracy as the only game in town. So based on the author, the turnovers of the power during the past 2 decades have enabled all major political figures, fractions, and the parties to take their turns governing in the country, making them responsible stakeholders. All right, so in the transition, so as you could see in the previous one, in previous article that was published in 1988, so there was only including the one election. So the Roh Tae-woo was the first democratically elected president. After then, Kim Young-sam, who was the more conservative, the liberal, the opposition party, first civilian president in 30 years. And Kim Dae-jung, again, the more in the progressive center left, the Congress of New Policies, the first peaceful opposition of the transfer, Roh Moo-hyun, which is the Uri Party, Uri Dang, surviving in peaceful crisis after 2004. So all three, so the more conservative, relatively more progressive or more liberal, the red color, and the Lee Myung-bak, 2008. Find the second peaceful opposition transfer. So based on the authors of the analysis, there were many peaceful transitions among the conservative party and the more progressive party. So they become all the responsible stakeholders in the democratic system, and saying that the democracy is the only game in the town. So, based on the author, the key factor of the development of the South Korea's democratic development was successful integration of the previously marginalized political groups and the ideological perspective to the mainstream political situation. So, more the left wing, called as the left wing, more the progressive parties, they were excluded a lot during the political regime of the authoritarian regime based on the national security law. There were many of the areas excluded, isolated in the governing power. The Jeolla area and many other places, they were included in the power in the regime. And so some of the people who were active, the protesters in 1980, they became the political leaders, and from the rigid anti-communist stance to acceptance of the welfare policies, labor rights, and the reconciliation with North Korea, even though there was not a major argument. So it became more flexible, more open, and more liberal compared with the conservative party in 1990, 1998, 1988. So, according to Ham, the elite pacts made agreements between political fractions in the figures through the criticized as the unprincipled and undemocratic at the time, actually facilitated very smooth transitions between governments with the different ideological positions. So, Roteo's ruling party merged with the Kim Young-sam and Kim Jong-il's opposition parties, integrating former rivals. So, you may remember that the Rohteo he was elected as a very minor. So they had some of the agreements, the pacts with the Kim Young-sam and Kim Jong-il, and helped the Kim Young-sam win in the election in the next term. And Kim Dae-jung's coalition formed a strategic alliance with the Kim Jong-il, despite his animosity of the secure electoral rivalry in the party. And interregional alliances in the Gyeongsang and the Jeonla leadership bridged regional divides through the political cooperation and institutional flexibility. Koreans in political institutions adapted to incorporate former outsiders, including leftists and the student activities. So the key term of the miraculous quality of the South Korea's democratic development arises from the fact that very events and the features which countries point to as the signs and the symptoms of the weakness were time and again turned into opportunities. So overcoming the crisis. So there were very huge crises in South Korea. So as you may remember from the many of the news articles and the media coverage, there was an external shock as a financial crisis and a president's impeachment crisis as a political internal shock. So 1997, the financial crisis was Korea's worst economic crisis. And even though there was a peaceful democratic transition of the power opposition, democratic system effectively managed IMF, the financial the reform, even though that had many of the negative outcomes. And then opposition-led parliament impeached the President Roh Moo-hyun. So democratic institutions worked designed with the fiscal resolution. So there were many of the democratic resilience saying that 1997 in the Tibet collapse and the contagion begins, and there was the financial crisis in the many of the Asian countries. And then there was a very large number, $58 billion in the IMF bailout imagine elected. And then 6.2 growth recovery area time begins and the IMF loan rapidly all repaid early. So even though there were the many of the crises of the very big debt and the very huge transitions, South Korea could achieve the demographic responses based on the political negotiations and others. So institutionalization of the political parties. So based on the article, South Korean democracy evolved from the personally driven politics toward the greater party institutionalization as democratic norms solidified. So there were many other parties. So 1977, high party volatility, frequently renaming in the risk structures. In the major parties that stabilized GMP and the Democratic parties, Grand National Party, which means the 한나라당, and the Democratic Minju당, and 2008, relatively mature party system with the programmatic competition. So shifting from the personal encourages the programmatic parties with the more consistent platforms. So that could be applied to the contemporary. So even though there was the transitions of the power who are ruling each party, so there are many of the competing leaders. There are many of the other outside parties within the party. So we can see that so the involvement, the evolution of the political party system was institutionalized in South Korea. And there was a significant sign of the demographic consolidation which is a transformation of the political disclosure of the South Korea from the grand ideological narrative to the pragmatic, which is the very, very minor and small the policy debates. So a long time ago, the many of the political debates were the grand narratives and democratization, anti-authoritarianism, and the nationalism. In late 1990s, the inclusion of the previous taboo topics like North Korea relations and social welfare reforms, and emergence of the practical debates of the economic growth and welfare policies and the government reforms. In 2007 election, the first campaign focused primarily on the policy rather than identity or ideology, which is who are the left wing or right wing instead of that. And expansion of the acceptable disclosure from the rigid anti-communism to diverse policy approaches. So based on this diversification, these discursive changes reflected the maturity of the Korean democracy, contentious issues that would be debated within the democratic institutions rather than through the protest and the confrontation. So in the regional inclusion, the Chola area, they were historically excluded from the decision making. But Kim Dae-jung's election in 1997, there was the first president from the Chola area, so which is the breaking the regional ceiling, and increased representation for Chola residents in the cabinet, in the Congress, and the government positions, and the healing of the some regional antagonisms through power sharing, and the generation inclusion instead of the very older generations. At that point in time, they were the younger generations, those in their 30s in the 1990s, born in the 1960s, who participated in the 1970 and 1980 democracy. Initial inclusion for the power despite the activism entered the politics during the Kim Dae-jung and the Roh Moo-hyun administrations, and expansion of political disclosure to include previously taboo topics. So instead of the skepticism, so they were skeptical many of the perspectives that on the generation inclusion and the regional inclusion that will lead into the instability. Ham argues that South Korea successfully overcame its authoritarian legacy. So based on the Constitutional Court, the 헌법재판소 in Korean, Constitutional Court independent jurisdiction, providing effective checks and balances, and the civil service reform, transitional justice, local government reform, and national security law reform. There were many of the improvement leading to the more democratization than others. All right. So there are many of the remaining challenges as I want to move this one here. Oh, no. Okay. The persistent the regionalism still in voting patterns in the political representation, and political corruption, and the clientelism, the counting from the authoritarian area, polarization of the wide policy swings between administrations. So when the Liberal Party held the Congress and the presidential election, there was some sort of the policies, and the Conservative Party get the election, there were many of the swings. And tension between strong presidential system and the democratic checks and the civil military relations and security challenges. So, based on the summary, consolidation achieved, but refinement continues. Visual reforms needed are details rather than fundamental regime changes. Korea's democracy now matches its economic development as a miracle in 2008. All right, so we can see that in 2007 election, Myung-Bak Lee, was the Conservative Party. He got about mostly about the 50% of the vote, while the more conservative, Progressive Party, Jong Dong-young, got the 26%. There was very, very big decisive shift for the politics. All right, there was very peaceful transition, even though there were many of the also the tensions between left-wing party and the right-wing party, but there was that thing. So based on that, the economic development on the 13th largest global economy, there were $20,000 per capita income. So there was the consensus that democracy achieved widespread success as the only game in town, merged with peaceful transfers and democratic processes survival, survived the financial crisis and the impeachment. So in summary, Ham argues by the 2008, the power alternation. So based on these instinct, power alteration, broadening ideological spectrum, and elite pact making enabled the very powerful, very peaceful transitions in there. So this is very miraculous quality of the changes of the on the democratic consolidation in their work. All right, so let's see some of the comparisons. So South Korea, we heard that bottom up plus top down, not only one. So that be the consolidation and inclusive stakeholders based on the power alteration, constitutional reform, and elite compromise and the mass protests. So compared with the South Korea, the China is the repressive model with the top down only, relatively no democratic transition and economic liberalization. So military repression, more the pressure of the governing power of the military, even though there was a stern protest, economic formally the authoritarian resilience. And Taiwan is more about the party-led transition. So based on the election result, the transitions are the changes. KMT led the reforms, the gradual liberalization and opposition legalized and the multi-party competition. So largely this is also top-down and peaceful transition, progressive reform compared with the regressive repression model. So Japan is externally imposed. So post World War II occupation, there was a new constitution in the democratic system and liberal institutions and the LDP dominance, which is eternal. So there was very limited alternation. So majorly the two parties are swinging their on the power, but this is more about the single party dominance. So in South Korea, high mass mobilization, high power alternation, and medium elite continuity. In China, we have the medium mass mobilization, no power alteration, high elite continuity. And Taiwan, low mass mobilization, medium power alternation, high elite continuity. Japan, no mass mobilization, low power alternation, medium elite continuity. No. So in Korea, in summarization, South Korea's democratic journey offers very valuable insights, including negotiation transition was succeed when combining pressure from below, from the bottom, with the the compromise, which is the transplacement. Demographic consolidation benefits from the repeated transfers, including all stakeholders based on region, ideologies, and generations, economic development, from democratization, create social conditions, and overcoming crises and hybrid paths with revolution or top-down reform can produce stable democratic outcomes. All right, so that's it of the lecture, the asynchronous lecture. Thank you very much for your attention and see you in class.